You can start.
Okay. Welcome everyone to another webinar in the IEO seminar series. My name is Joshua Wojnalower and I'm an economist in the IEO. Today's webinar will feature two recent papers on the value of IMF forecast and discuss them in the context of the IEO's 2014 evaluation of IMF forecasts. I'm going to share a slide quickly. Can you see that? Okay. The IEO hosts these seminars as part of its mandate. Excuse me, please keep your mics on mute.
T20 or ODIs in the last 2-3 years.
Everyone could keep their mics on mute, that would be great. The IEO hosts these seminars as part of its mandate to promote a learning culture in the fund and as part of its evidence gathering process for current and future evaluations. Similar evidence gathering took place prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, this type of forum has allowed us to get constructive feedback from a much broader group. This particular webinar is not directly part of any current IEO evaluations. However, as you can see on the slide, it is related to a possible topic for future IEO evaluations, namely IMF research and forecasting. Separately, the IEO is beginning an evaluation of the IMF's emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So please keep an eye out for future seminars related to that topic. With that background out of the way, let me introduce our stellar panelists. Up first is Umberto Collodel. Umberto is a PhD candidate at the Paris School of Economics, an external consultant for the IEO, and a former IEO summer intern. Drawing on joint work with Zidong An and Prakash Lungani, he will be presenting research on when, where, and why forecasters get it wrong. Next up will be Julia Estefania Flores, a research analyst in the IMF's Asia Pacific Department, and Siddharth Kothari, an economist in the IMF's Asia Pacific Department. Drawing on joint work with Davide Forseri and Jonathan Ostry, they will present research on why public debt forecasts are worse than you think. Then Francesco Luna, a senior economist in the IMF's Institute for Capacity Development, will follow these presentations, commenting on these works in the context of the IEO's 2014 evaluation of IMF forecasts. Francesco actually helped with that evaluation, authoring a background paper on IMF forecasts in the context of program countries. Finally, we hope to have 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. We ask that you keep your mics on mute until then. And with that, let me turn the mic over to Umberto.
Can you hear me? Yes, right. So let me share the screen with you. Can you see the screen? Yes. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you IEO for hosting the seminar and to all attendants. So the title of this presentation is When, Where, and Why Forecasters Get It Wrong, and is based on an ongoing work with Zidong An from the Renmin University of China and Prakash Lungani of IEO. So in this presentation, what we're focusing on is short-term growth forecasts of economic activity. And by short-term, what we mean is current year and year ahead. And we are going to focus on all main institutional forecasters and the private sector. So what is the interest that short-term growth forecasts have to us? Well, they are the building stone for other crucial products that are fiscal forecasts and debt forecasts, on which we are going to have a presentation later. And as such, they drive policy advices to member countries, as well as they drive the allocation of cross-border capital flows and domestic flows from private investors. Notwithstanding their importance, however, these forecasts have been continuously criticized by the academic world, news agencies, and governments alike. And to give you just a brief example of this, I report the title of an article that appeared last August in The Economist. So let me give you a short roadmap of the structure of the presentation. We're going to focus. Yeah, sorry for that. We're going to focus on 3 different chunks. So in the first stage, we're going to focus on comparison, accuracy of different forecasters. So when we are comparing different institutions, are the forecasts produced by them any different? Are they different only for some income groups? Are these results robust across the different forecast horizons? And our general answer is no. All forecasts resemble each other, and they show perfect collinearity. The second point that we are going to discuss is that one of bias. By bias, we mean, are individual country forecasts on average optimistic or pessimistic? By how much, what this entails, and why this is the case. So on this, we find that IEO forecasts optimism is widespread, and this stems from an asymmetry between forecast errors during recession and none, meaning forecast errors tend to be extremely large and negative during recession periods. Finally, we're going to move from surveillance forecast to program forecast. And here we're going to investigate whether large programs correspond to larger forecast errors. And we are going to show that indeed this is the case. However, we do not find any evidence that this is made on purpose. Indeed, the same relationship is found for the private sector. So let me start by the first chunk, that is the comparison section. We assembled a large panel of growth forecasts. So we are drawing from the IMF IEO, both the April and October vintage, the World Bank Global Economic Prospects, and the European Commission AMECO database, as well as the consensus forecast. Consensus forecast, we have from 20 to 30 individual forecasters for every country year. So our baseline is going to be the consensus mean, but we are going to have the results also taking into account the individual forecasters. What is important to keep in mind here when comparing is that we are minimizing the time difference between forecasts. Otherwise, the results would be driven only by differences in the underlying information set. So in this first series of graphs, what you see from the upper, starting from the upper left corner, going until the bottom, is the correlation of current year spring forecast of IEO with World Bank, European Commission, and finally consensus. So what you see is that the scatter points are clustered around the 45 degrees lines. That indicates almost perfect collinearity of the forecasts. So after this, the question is, maybe this could hold just for the current year horizon. And maybe as we move back, for example, for year ahead forecast, this could be different because, for example, World Bank and IMF are using different econometric methodologies or have different availability of data. So we're actually testing this proposition. In the slide, what you see is the correlation matrix of IEO forecasts with respectively World Bank, European Commission, and consensus at the different horizons. And as you can see, the correlation is always above 75%. So this means that it doesn't make any difference to consider different sources of forecasts. And from now on our presentation, we will just give results for the IEO. And let me move to the second chunk of the presentation that deals instead with bias. So first of all, what do we mean by bias? We mean a systematic over-under prediction of the growth rate. So we calculate forecast errors as the difference between the actual value of the growth in a specific country year and the actual growth rate is the growth rate reported in the following year fall World Economic Outlook publication, minus the forecast for the growth rate made each steps ahead. So once we have the series for each country, we then regress these forecast errors on an intercept and on a residual term, where the intercept represents the average forecast error. And we run a test of significance on it. What do we find is that optimism is more prevalent than pessimism. In the panels, you see the share of countries from the IEO sample in which we find optimistic or pessimistic biases. So in the upper left corner, we have the current year fall issue, and you see that optimistic and pessimistic bias are almost balanced, 11% of countries in the sample. As we move back, there is a monotonic increase in optimistic biases, and the reverse trend holds instead for pessimistic biases. So we end up at the year ahead spring horizons with 40% of the countries in the sample that show an optimistic bias. So clearly the following question would be, how big is this bias? What is the magnitude? It could be that pessimistic bias are quite big actually compared to the optimistic biases. And this is exactly what we show in the next slide. So here you have the distribution of the significant intercepts, or if you want, of the significant average forecast errors for the optimistic and the pessimistic case. And as you can see, there is not much of a difference as the two are kind of mirroring each other. So the average bias always hovers around 1%. Also in this case, however, one could ask, what does actually this 1% mean? Is just an absolute value. To show what it means, we turn to a simple simulation exercise. So here we exploit the debt to GDP equation, in which basically debt to GDP at time t depends on debt to GDP at the previous time, times the interest rate and divided by the growth rate, plus the fiscal balance. In this case, we assume for sake of simplicity that the fiscal balance is 0. So on the orange line, you see the debt to GDP path simulated for 20 periods with the actual growth rate of 2%, while we fix the interest rate to be 2.5%. So you see that after 20 periods, there is an upward path and debt to GDP reaches almost 80%. Now, if instead staff were to use the biased forecast, that is a growth rate of 3%, the actual path that they would obtain is decreasing. So this would lead to totally different policy advices. Now, if you remember from the introduction, we ascribe these biases, these optimistic biases, to the difference in forecast errors between recession periods and non-recession periods. So before going into that, it's good to have to understand what is the distribution of actual values of real GDP growth. So we define recessions as periods of negative growth. And as you can see from the plot, recessions amount to roughly 10 to 15% of our country year observations. So we can say that are for sure more rare than non-recession periods, but still they are far from being an outlier event. So to show why this difference stems from the asymmetry, this graph is extremely important. Here you see the forecast error at the year ahead fall horizon, conditional on the actual being a no-recession period and a recession period. So if we look at the blue distribution, you see that actually forecast errors, sometimes they are negative, sometimes positive, but overall they are balanced, symmetric around zero. If we look instead solely at the red distribution, it is completely shifted to the left of zero. What this means is that for virtually every instance in which we have a recession in a country year, the fund is not predicting the onset of the recession or underplaying its magnitude. And in this following slide, what we show exactly the same, so forecast errors conditional on the state of the business cycle, and we show it for all the different institutions in our sample. What is interesting to notice is that World Bank and European Commission, for example, have totally different samples. So the World Bank focuses on emerging markets and low-income economies, while the European Commission mainly on advanced economies. But if you look at them, for both, the red distribution is almost completely tilted to the left of zero, meaning that this failure, let's call it failure to predict recessions, is common actually to all income groups. The next step that we asked was, since we have granular data on individual private forecasters, is if we take the best guy and we define the best guy as the one who gets closest to the actual value in each period, is this guy rocking the boat? Meaning, is this guy able to correctly predict the magnitude of recessions? And in this slide, you actually have the answer that is no. Again, if you focus on the red distribution, also in this case is almost completely shifted to the left of zero. This means that the failure to predict recession is common to the whole economic profession. Then we asked ourselves why this is the case, and we came up with some possible explanations. So the first explanation is just that there are some poor modeling methodologies or availability of data, and clearly here the answer is to develop further into the big data field and machine learning algorithms. And there is a lot of work being done actually, for example, in the African department. I saw recently a presentation on that. The second explanation is a lack of incentives, meaning in terms of reputational losses, it's better to not predict a recession than to predict a recession when it's not actually happening, giving a fake alarm. The third explanation is behavioral reasons. So we as forecasters, we tend to have sticky priors so that the bad news is broken gradually. And actually you see that for recession that lasts more than 1 year, forecasts tend to be more accurate over the horizon. And finally, we have the last explanation that is the most dismal of the four, that is the underlying process determining a recession is a random shock. So we cannot do anything about it. So we dug a bit deeper on this last hypothesis, and I'm going to show you the results in this slide. So here you have the forecast errors of IEO at the year ahead fall and spring horizons, conditional on the actual being a no recession period, a normal recession period, and a recession accompanied by a single financial crisis that could be a currency, a debt, or a banking crisis, and a recession plus twin financial crisis. And if you look at the graphs at the distribution, how they move from bottom to top, you see that actually forecast errors tend to be larger when the period is one of recessions accompanied by complex financial crisis. This tells us that the problem of predicting GDP growth and predicting financial crisis, they are tightly linked, And hence, a thorough evaluation of early warnings can give us some more information about the last of our hypotheses. Now, so far we worked with surveillance forecast. We now move in this last section to program forecast. Why it's important to focus on this subset? Because the methodology involved in program forecast, as some authors already noted, is intrinsically different from surveillance forecast, meaning that there is more of a political negotiation between staff members and the political representatives of the country. Moreover, what we want to investigate is the relationship between large programs and large forecast errors. Why is that? For two reasons. The fund could use more optimistic forecast to justify a high level of disbursement. And at the same time, as a program is granted, it becomes a de facto creditor. Hence, there is an interest in producing higher forecasts, better forecasts, because there is an interest in attracting new capital to the country. So what we test is this relationship, and to do so, we use data from MONA, covering the period 2002-2019 and roughly 200 programs. What we find in a regression setting is, if you focus on the red box, that indeed this relationship between large programs and large forecast errors is found to be significant. And quantitatively speaking, a 1% increase in the total amount of the program in percentage of the quota increases the optimistic error by 0.001%. This result is robust to different controls that are the time at which the forecast is made, as well as the different types of programs. So basically here we test for the difference between concessional and non-concessional programs. The next step is asking, okay, we found that the relationship exists, but do we find any evidence that these larger forecasts, more optimistic forecasts, are done on purpose? And to do so, to answer this question, what we do is we compare MONA forecasts with consensus forecasts with the private sector. So if the private sector is actually not having this optimism, then it would be evidence that, that there is a deliberate bias. What we find is that actually the two, as it was for the surveillance case, are extremely correlated, both in the current year and year ahead horizon. So that when we estimate the same relationship with consensus data, we obtain a statistically equivalent relationship. And to give you just some anecdotal evidence on this, we report forecasts for 3 of the largest recent programs, Greece, Ukraine, and Argentina. And you can see by yourself that actually forecasts from MONA and the private sector are comparable. So let me try to wrap up and conclude on what we have done so far. In this paper, what we have done is we wanted to give a broad view on short-term growth projections. And to do so, we relied on a large panel, including all the major institutional forecasters and the private sectors. What did we find? We find that forecasts are actually equal between different institutions and private sectors. We found that optimism is widespread. And the reason for this is that there is a failure of the profession to forecast the onset and the extent of recessions. And finally, we found for programs that larger programs correspond to larger optimistic errors. However, we do not find any evidence that this is done on purpose. So to conclude, to draw some conclusion from the policy point of view in time of this pandemic, there should be extremely care in policymakers should be extremely careful in giving policy advice to member countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Umberto. Julia and Siddharth, share your presentation.
Sure, let me just share.
Okay, can you hear me? So thank you for the organizers of the seminar. I'm going to present along with Siddharth Kothari joint work with Davide Fuccieri and Jonathan Ostri, all colleagues of the IMF, on public debt forecast errors in advanced and developing economies. Next slide. So yeah, our motivation of this study is mostly summarized in the chart you can see on the right side of the slide, where you can see that the debt ratios have increased since the global financial crisis, and they have remained high, leading to the this next crisis, the COVID crisis, mainly because of slow growth and the large fiscal packages that the countries have been implementing. But what is most catchy in this chart is that we are projecting the debt ratios to stabilize in the short term and then decline. If forecasts are realized, then the vulnerabilities of the countries will likely stay contained. However, if the debt ratios instead increase further, it may expose vulnerabilities and undermine market confidence. So looking at this chart, we were wondering how accurate are these forecasts. Next slide. So our key questions are four. So first one is, on average, are medium-term forecast errors unbiased? Then we also look at which countries show larger forecast errors on average, and also if these forecast errors are associated with the inability to anticipate recessions, or if we can also see a systematic forecast error irrespective of these episodes. And the last question would be, what can past forecast errors tell us about possible death paths in the aftermath of the COVID-19 shock, which would be, what can we learn from the past? Next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly summarize our findings. We find that at the 5-year horizon, realized debt ratios are close to 10% of GDP higher than what is forecasted. The magnitude of these forecast errors is similar for both advanced and emerging economies, but we do see that for advanced economies, these are mainly driven by the inability to predict recessions. Meanwhile, for EMDEs, the forecast errors are systematically positive, irrespective of recessions. We also see that forecast errors are significantly larger when we are projecting the debt to decrease instead of when we're projecting the debt to increase, and that the forecast errors in growth projections are a key driver on forecast errors on debt, but there are other factors that play an equally important role. Regarding countries, we see that oil exporters and more volatile countries tend to have larger forecast errors. And regarding the question of what can we learn from the past, if post-global financial crisis forecast errors were to repeat, debt ratios in emerging markets would increase close to 73% of GDP in 2025, instead of declining to 63% as it's currently forecasted. On the literature, I'm going to go quickly on this. So there's plenty of literature on growth forecast, mainly related to the inability to predict recessions and weak institutions. And there's a smaller literature on fiscal forecast, mainly on budget deficit. And it is mainly focused on Europe because there's very good data for the countries that belong under the Stability and Growth Pact. And there has also been some attempts from the IMF to identify and combat optimist bias in the context of surveillance on lending. So our contribution here would be that we look at debt forecast errors, and also that we have a pretty wide sample of countries to analyze this. So on our data, we compile a comprehensive data set of medium-term forecast from 2 different sources. The first one is IMF data. Here we have biannual forecasts from April and October WIO. And this data starts in 1995. This leads us to an unbalanced panel of 174 countries, with the country coverage improving gradually over time. And then the other source from the private sector would be the Economist Intelligence Unit. The EOI, they publish their forecast monthly. So what we've done is we just took April and October forecast to enhance the comparability with the IMF data. Their data starts in 2007, and it leads to an unbalanced panel of 109 countries. And okay, so regarding how we construct forecast errors, what we do is we use the difference between the realized debt to GDP ratio and the forecasted debt to GDP ratio for a certain year and a country. So for example, for a forecast made for 2007, we will compare this number with the realized number published in October vintage from the WIO in 2008. And we're always using October data because the coverage for realized data is better. So given this calculation, a positive forecast error implies that the debt ratio outturn was high and that was what forecasted. The main caveat with this methodology is that the rebasing of the GDP can impact forecast errors estimates and can make more difficult to compare them through time. So what we've done is we construct an alternative measure, which is calculated the same as the previous one, but instead of using debt ratios, what we do is we use changes in debt ratios. So we attenuate the rebasing bias, and we use this measure for robustness for all of our results. And now Siddharth is going to continue presenting the main results. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to the IEO again for hosting us. So Julia kind of set it up, and now let me get into the details of our results. So what these charts here show are simple stylized facts about the average forecast errors for different time horizons. So on the x-axis, you have different horizons, and we can go up to 5 years ahead because that's where our forecasts stop. So the gray shaded region is the interquartile range. The black line in the middle is the median of the forecast error, and the dots are the means. So 3 things really stand out. So first, looking at IMF forecast errors on the left-hand side, is that the forecast errors tend to increase with the horizon. They tend to be statistically significant even at the 1 year horizon, and that they are also very economically significant. At the 5 year horizon, the average forecast error is close to 10% of GDP. And this is not just an IMF forecast phenomenon. If you look at the Economist Intelligence Unit forecasts, they have a very similar profile of forecast errors. If anything, a little larger average forecast error, but this is almost entirely driven by differences in sample. If we do a balanced sample for both EIU and the IMF, then the average forecast errors are pretty similar for the 2 sources. So the first question that arises is that, is this mainly driven by emerging market and developing economies, or is it also an advanced economy issue? And here the answer turns out to be a bit subtle. So what the charts here show are the average forecast errors for the 2 groups. And if you just look at our entire sample, then the forecast errors are pretty similar in magnitude. If anything, the advanced economy forecast errors are slightly larger. But actually, there are very important differences in timing of these forecast errors. And that's what these charts here are trying to get at. So what these are showing is average forecast errors for our 2 groups, vintage by vintage. And what really strikes out is that for advanced economies, there were very large forecast errors in vintages leading up to the global financial crisis. And this is kind of similar to what Umberto was saying, that we do not forecast recessions. The global financial crisis was a big recession, which we did not forecast. So the 2006 forecasts for debt ratios were not foreseeing the very large increase in debt that occurred due to growth plummeting and due to the fiscal stimulus that was implemented in response to the GFC. So advanced economies had these very large forecast errors for vintages before the GFC, but kind of as the dust settled, a few vintages into the GFC, the advanced economy forecast errors basically on average go to zero. What's interesting is for EMDEs, there was a large positive forecast error leading up to the GFC, but these forecast errors have persisted after the GFC as well, indicating a more systematic issue with forecasts. Now, in a later slide, we'll explore specifically the role of recessions more carefully, but let me move on for now. So next, what we did is we just looked at forecast errors for by region, and basically all regions in the world display a very similar forecast error. You could argue that forecast errors are slightly larger in sub-Saharan Africa and mean on average, but really there's no statistical difference between the averages for different regions. Moving on, so the next thing that we looked at, which we thought was interesting, is that the size of forecast errors seems to depend crucially on the trajectory of the forecast itself. So focusing on the left chart here on IMF forecast errors, what the first column is showing is the forecast error when the projection was for debt to stay stable or increase over the 5-year horizon. And you see that while the forecast error on average is positive, it is pretty small. But when for country vintages where we were projecting debt ratios to decline over the forecast horizon, the forecast errors tend to be a lot larger. So this is basically saying that in times, like exactly when we think that the public sector balance sheet will improve, when debt ratios will go down, is when we tend to make the largest forecast errors. So the next thing we looked at is programs versus no programs. Do we make larger or smaller forecast errors during programs? We didn't look at kind of by size of program where Umberto, the way Umberto did, but just like a dichotomous grouping into forecasts which were made in the middle of a program versus those when there was no program with the IMF. And so basically what we find is that the average forecast errors are very similar in programs versus no programs. So the forecast errors are large, but it's not that the forecast errors for debt ratios over 5 years are larger when we have programs or smaller. They are basically statistically indistinguishable. One interesting result that we found is that for precautionary programs, the average forecast errors do tend to be smaller compared to non-precautionary programs. This is potentially an interesting result which can be explored further. It could be that precautionary programs, there's less autocorrelation in shocks, so precautionary programs tend to have smaller shocks, negative shocks in their forecast horizon. But it's not something which we've explored in a lot of detail, and it's something I think worth exploring. So far, we've just talked about forecast, kind of just the medium-term forecast errors for debt to GDP ratio. But what we try doing next is to try look at contributors. So is it growth forecast errors? Is it fiscal deficit forecast errors? Now, in a perfect world where we had all the data that we wanted, we could potentially do a detailed decomposition, also looking at maybe exchange rate effects, contingent liabilities, and things like that. But given that we wanted to kind of do this analysis for a wide range of countries and for a long period of time, data constraints basically made us focus on two areas, which we also think are probably the two most important. So what we ended up focusing on forecast errors in growth versus forecast errors on fiscal deficits. And what these charts here show is kind of like an accounting exercise, your standard debt decompositions, which every DSA shows. So what we do is we isolate the contribution of fiscal deficit misses and growth misses based on your standard debt equation. And looking at this, you see that fiscal misses on average tend to cause debt forecast errors of about 5% of GDP, while growth misses about 2.5%. Now, this might make you think that fiscal deficits are more important, fiscal deficit forecast errors, but of course you need to kind of interpret this carefully, because it could be that the fiscal deficit forecast errors are occurring because we missed our growth forecast. So to try to kind of isolate this a little more, instead of just doing this accounting exercise, we do a very simple regression exercise where we regress debt forecast errors, 5-year ahead debt forecast errors on forecast errors for growth, fiscal deficits, and then the two combined. So the first column just shows you the average forecast error. So it's just forecast error regressed on a constant, which is about 8.7% of GDP for IMF forecast. Now the second column adds growth forecast errors for each horizon. So as expected, the coefficient is negative, meaning when growth turns out to be less than what we were forecasting, the debt forecast errors tend to be larger. And what's interesting is that the constant remains significant and about 4%, which is saying that even if all growth forecast errors was 0, the average forecast error for debt ratios is about 4% of GDP. And adding fiscal deficit forecast errors does reduce this coefficient a little, but it still leaves a residual of about 3.7% of GDP, which is the constant in the last column, indicating that probably some other factors that are not correlated with growth and fiscal deficit forecast errors are also important. It could be exchange rates, it could be contingent liabilities, it could be measurement error, which is also being subsumed in our constant term, essentially. Moving on, so that was looking at kind of contributors to the forecast errors. Next, what we try to do is just see what country characteristics are potentially associated with large average forecast errors. So we do very simple cross-country regressions, a cross-sectional regression where we take the average forecast error for each country in the post-GFC period and regress it on a bunch of country characteristics. The key results that we find is that, especially in the post-GFC period, poorer countries tend to have larger forecast errors on average. Also, interestingly, we find that oil exporters and or more volatile countries tend to have larger forecast errors on average. This was, I think, an interesting result because a priori, you do not necessarily expect more volatile countries to have larger average forecast errors because positive and negative forecast errors could in principle cancel out. So what this is suggesting is that oil exporters or more volatile countries either have more pro-cyclical policies during good times, or in our sample, they just happen to have more negative shocks. And then the final result we find is that higher average debt levels tend to be associated with larger forecast errors, which could again be because kind of a similar miss in growth forecast errors can lead to a larger effect on debt forecast errors when debt levels are higher. We also try a bunch of other variables, fiscal tools, other volatility measures.
And this is my understanding and my recollection.
Other volatility measures, and they tend to not be significant. So very quickly, focusing on recessions, as Umberto said, like we know that economists tend to not be able to forecast recessions. So an interesting question is that are large debt forecast errors simply a result of us not being able to forecast recession? So if we look at periods where no recession fell in the forecast horizon, are debt forecast errors minor in that case? And what's interesting is that here the answer really depends on whether you are looking at advanced economies or EMDs. So if you look at this chart here, the blue columns are debt forecast errors for country vintages where a recession fell in the forecast horizon, while the orange bars are when no recession falls in the forecast horizon. For advanced economies, basically the blue bars are close to zero and insignificant, while the orange bars are very large and positive. So very large forecast errors when there's a recession falling in the forecast horizon, but almost nothing when there's no recession. But for EMDs, actually, even the non-recession periods tend to have a positive and significant forecast error, again indicating there's something more systematic in EMDs. So those were our main results. I just want to quickly go over a case study for Japan, which is interesting because it's just interesting to see how large our forecast errors can be. So as you know, Japan is a country which saw a very sharp increase in debt ratios throughout the 1990s and through the GFC period, and also a decline in growth. And if you look at our forecast errors, on average, they've been about 30% of GDP. And really what's driving it is that we, and by we, I just don't mean the IMF, general economic forecasters, never really internalized this increasing trend. It took more than like a decade for us to realize that Japanese debt ratios will continue to increase. So right from 1995 up to the GFC, the forecast errors for debt ratios were at about 30% of GDP for Japan. And the last exercise that I want to do is really a pretty simple, naive exercise almost, to see what could debt projections, what could debt ratios look like in the future if forecast errors happen again, which are comparable to what occurred after the GFC. So what these charts here show are just, so the dotted red lines show our projections for debt to GDP ratio right after the GFC hit, so 2009 April vintage, while the blue line shows the outcome in the 2015 vintage. And as you can see, both for advanced economies and EMDEs, the realized debt ratios were a lot higher than what was forecast. And so what we do next is we just simply take these country by country forecast errors and apply it to the forecasts that were made in the October 2020 vintage of the VO. And what we get is that basically instead of debt ratios stabilizing and declining as we are currently projecting, if GFC forecast errors were to repeat, debt ratios would increase and by about 10 percentage points relative to our forecasts for EMDs. So let me just say a few words on conclusions. So there has been greater focus on debt vulnerabilities post-COVID, especially for EMDEs. And what our results indicate is that that while this focus is very much welcome, we might still be underestimating the level of vulnerabilities. Accuracy of debt forecasts are, of course, critical for planning. So greater realism would be very helpful. In terms of how to mitigate these vulnerabilities, the standard lines really, that especially for EMDs, there's probably scope for more concessional financing. There might be need for some restructuring for some countries where the G20 framework will be super important. And also important to keep in mind that that growth forecast errors are a big player in debt forecast errors. So making sure that our growth forecasts are good and ensuring that policies are put in place which help with medium-term growth are probably equally important as of now. So let me just stop here. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
Thank you both. I think we'll actually hold for questions until after Francesco has a turn to comment on the papers. Francesco, would you like to share your presentation?
Yes, going to. Yeah. I think you should be seeing it. Okay. So let me start saying that indeed I was one of the contributors to this evaluation, IEO evaluation in 2014. So it's good to be back, and just at least just for this conversation. My comments are going to be mainly about the first presentation, because I got to see the second one only this morning, basically. But there is something about the results found in the second presentation about debt and about fiscal projections in particular, because those were the topic, one of the topics that we covered when I dealt with my background paper on projections, forecasts in the context of program countries. Okay, so these are the main results of the presentations. As you've seen, that Umberto presented, the inability to forecast recessions. The different forecasts resemble each other. They have a high level of collinearity. And then the IMF supported program forecasts tend to be more optimistic for large programs. So I'll take each one of these one after the other. So I wanted to say that the focus of the original evaluation was a little broader, of course, because it was dealing with the transparency of the process. Member countries are quote unquote complaining, or were complaining that IEO forecasts were basically a black box. They would not know how really the procedure to reach such forecasts. Then, of course, the big chunk of the evaluation was about the quality of forecasts, but it was covering individual or separately different dimensions. So it was distinguishing between short-term and medium-term, and the medium-term were 3, 4, 5 years ahead, and then surveillance versus program. So the quality of forecasts analysis was broader in a sense. And then of course, the evaluation was also focusing on the procedures, because the idea was to see whether indeed the followed procedures by desks and by the IEO process, in the IEO process, could be amended perhaps to improve and to correct part at least of the systematic errors that we also found. So, inability to forecast recessions. We certainly had the same results in 2014 in the original evaluation. And indeed, a few well-placed dummies would eliminate the bias, the statistically significant bias. But also, which is more, of course, more important, if you want, more significant for programs, in the context of programs, the inability to project, to time the recoveries. And so, and these, of course, were the source of many criticism to IMF, to the IMF. And in particular, you may remember these so-called spaghetti graphs for the case of Argentina and Greece, based on different IEO's forecast vintages, no? Where each time it looked like a recovery was undergoing, and instead the recession kept. As you mentioned already in the previous presentations, this is also the inability not only to project the beginning of a recession, but also the severity of a recession. So this is linked to that, for sure. Okay, and then talking about the process, the procedures followed by desks, by economists, we during our interviews, we kept hearing about this unwritten rule that was about closing the gap. And, in 3 years, independently of how severe the crisis was, you were supposed to close the gap. Okay, and this end gap, Andy Berg was asking about the article eventually published by Serra and Saxena about the scars of recessions, and how it is statistically, the stylized fact is that the gap is not with respect to what the potential would have been originally, but the potential changes, of course, after a recession. So even the idea of closing the gap changed, or we were looking when we were discussing this, the gap was still the one recorded with respect to the potential before the crisis. Okay, so the idea that a crisis would scar and would not only temporary but permanently reduce the potential was not really appreciated at the time. Okay. Different forecasts resemble each other. From interviews, we noticed again that there is no incentive to deviate from consensus. It was also expressed as no incentive to rock the boat, okay, unless you had a very strong stories. Okay, so and similarly, or going in the same direction, there is certainly a cross-pollination of forecasts. The central banks for advanced economies in particular would get in touch with the IMF, with the desks, to compare notes, if you want. So eventually the forecasts were of course are not really completely independent. Okay, so there is certainly this idea of the cross-pollination of forecasts that in some sense explains and make the results of the perfect linearity that Umberto was showing not surprising. Okay, and also there is this other aspect for medium-term projections. Again, there were, at least at the time of the projection of the evaluation of the 2014 evaluation, not many incentives to invest much time and resources. Okay, the economists were saying, look, our APR is going to be based, if you want, on how well we perform now, in the next 12 months, if you want. There is no real incentive, no way actually of accountability. There's no way to tell how good that projection was 3 years ago. Okay, so we looked at the procedures that were in place to facilitate or to foster learning from past mistakes. And indeed, these analyses are there, or the instruments, the tools are available, but as we noticed, these procedures are not always utilized to their full potential. So again, there is this idea of for these medium, especially for the medium-term projections, some limitations in the procedures. Okay. Now, forecasts are optimistic for large programs. Indeed. Now, in the analysis I did again with the MONA database, of course, the number of observation at the time was smaller because I couldn't
Like we've lost Francesco for the moment. Let's give him a moment to see if his connection returns. Francesco, can you hear us at all? Okay, I guess while we wait for Francesco to get back on, we can try to discuss a few questions. So one of the questions posed in the chat that perhaps one of the presenters could discuss is, given the vast evidence, what does the IMF learn from the extraordinary uncertainty surrounding the recent pandemic? And what does the systemic and long-lasting optimism bias mean for the debt sustainability analysis that will define a debt relief envelope, such as in the current G20 common framework? Speak up if you have an answer.
So, sorry, could you repeat the question, Joshua?
Sure. So the question is, what does the systemic and long-lasting optimism bias mean for the debt sustainability analyses for the debt relief envelope in the context of the current pandemic?
That's an interesting question. I think, so I'm not an expert on how the debt relief envelopes are set. The results do indicate that we probably want to take a close look at our medium-term forecasts. And to the extent that we might be underestimating that might mean that we need a larger envelope. But I would have to defer to SPR to who would know more about exactly how these envelopes are set.
Okay, thank you.
So may I add something on this?
Sure, please.
So in my view, it also means that, you know, if growth forecasts tend to be always optimism, so you have already some countries that are embarking on fiscal consolidation. So this is something to keep in mind, even though, as was already noticed, then we could have some debt problems. But for sure, it's something to keep in mind when giving policy advice, in my view.
Great. Another question, which came from Joseph Crawley. IMF growth forecasts are not means, they are modes, most likely outcomes. Is that correct? And if so, wouldn't outcomes that are on average lower than IMF forecasts be expected? Do either of you have views on that topic?
I think that is accurate, that like we do tend to that our forecasts are supposed to be the most likely outcomes. Now, yes, like if the distribution is skewed to the left, then the mode would be larger. But I think it's like, especially from the debt perspective, I think it is important to kind of realize that an implication of this, like if the implication of a modal forecast is that you tend to underestimate debt, then that is something for us to internalize. So one way could be that we need to build in buffers into our debt forecast. You could build in a buffer of 4-5% of GDP to give you a better sense of sustainability. But I think from the debt perspective, kind of, if this channel is generating a systematic forecast error, then that's something which we need to internalize.
Thank you. A question from Andrew Berg. Do either of the papers find evidence for the argument in Serra and Saxena that we underestimate the persistence of negative growth shocks after crises or big recession?
So I think that that maybe Prakash can answer on this, since he has done more work than me on the recession topic?
Okay, so I think the short answer is no. We haven't really looked at it through that lens. I mean, the work that Umberto talked about is only focused on the current year and year ahead forecasts. So one would have to look at the IMF's sort of medium run forecast to see, whether they have a strong mean reverting property or they respect the Serra-Saxena finding that there are big drops in the level of GDP following recessions. I think that Paulo Mauro did some work on this. I don't think he's on the line today. He did some work on medium-term forecast, but unfortunately, I don't recall whether he also looked at it through this lens of whether or not we always have this tendency to have a strong mean reverting component in our forecasts. One thing to say here is that the finding from the previous IEO evaluation that Francesco was mentioning.
I'm back, by the way.
Sorry to lose you, Francesco, but I think you were close to being done. Is that correct? You were on your last.
Yes, I had
Okay.
the final considerations with respect to the fiscal and the program in the context of program countries. So
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just about to characterize your findings on medium term. So you should correct me after I've mangled it. But anyway, my reading of the IEO 2014 evaluation, Andy, was that the amount of attention given to medium-term forecasts was much less than what was given to the current year and year ahead. So I'm suggesting that there may have been a tendency to say in the medium run, things kind of are mean reverting and you go back to the previous growth path. But maybe Francesco can add as well on whether they actually looked at whether or not there was any evidence on whether we allowed for a drop in GDP following recessions.
No, but indeed, what we recorded was that the attention to the medium term was certainly less. I don't know when my presentation stopped, but as I was saying, indeed our interviews showed that the incentive for desks to focus, to invest in medium term forecasts was certainly much less than for the current year or 1 year ahead. So for sure. Yes, so this is certainly true, and indeed that was part of the recommendations of the evaluation to actually invest more and come up with mechanisms that would incentivize the investment in these endeavors, and try on a regular basis to learn from the past mistakes. Okay, from the forecast errors, especially the systematic ones, so as to incorporate them in going forward. And at the time, the mechanisms were there, of course, but were not very generally employed. So that is for sure. And as I was saying, again, I don't know whether you heard that, another aspect was the idea that the unwritten rule that you would have to close the gap, and your way of projecting the medium term would be to have to close the gap in 2 to 3 years, depending on the severity of the recession. And certainly the idea of the scar of the recession was certainly not there. The Serra-Saxena idea was not there, and that was incorporated only after the Great Recession. So that's certainly something that we already in 2014 had evidence of. If I may go back only to the fiscal thing, just because what I found interesting enough for the program countries is that taken all together, the program countries were not showing a statistically significant bias, talking about GDP and inflation, okay? And it is in the exceptional access that the bias became significant, okay? And on the other hand, and of course, these exceptional access are the ones that attract the attention of the media. So it looked like that the IMF is always wrong when for program countries, right? Which is not the case if we take the full, at the time at least, the full sample. But there was, in the context of the program countries, we did not look only at GDP and inflation, but we looked also at the deficit projections, forecasts for deficit and for foreign reserves, okay? Foreign reserves. And the results there were kind of interesting because if for the GDP there would be an optimistic bias, for both the deficits and the foreign exchange reserves, the bias was pessimistic. And again, by discussing with our counterparts, we tended to think that if there is a stigma for a program to enter, for a country to enter a program with the IMF, showing in some sense some weakness, some inability to deal with the problems individually, on their own, there is even a larger stigma attached to going off track. Okay, and so indeed there is this bias that tend to make things quote unquote easier. So because typically the quantitative targets are attached to the fiscal performance, are attached to the exchange rate accumulation, current account performance, and so on. And these are the forecasts where the IMF tended to be pessimistic, okay, statistically significant bias according to our results. Okay.
Thank you, Francesco.
Thank you.
I wanted to give Andrew Berg an opportunity to speak if he would like it. I know he's been active in the chat. Andrew, are you there? It looks like we lost him. Okay, there's 1 or 2 more minutes. If anyone has any specific questions, or if any of the presenters have any final comments they want to make, you can either raise your hand physically or in the chat. If not, I guess we will end it there. Thank you everyone for attending today, and thank you to all our presenters for this very informative webinar. And we hope to see you all again soon for another topic. So thank you very much. Have a good day.